Right. It is. I think it's a very relevant topic, and hopefully want to just maybe how we view things in the landscape. And so honestly, that's how I want to start things is, what is a grassland? And so take just a second in your mind, what picture is painted in your mind? Just hold on to that. Or when I say grassland, what's that image that's captured in there? Then I want you to go and turn to page 3 in that pocket book, or that pocket guide. And do those things align? And so for those that didn't grab one, this is the definition of a grassland. And if they're different, I just want you to hold on to that as we kind of visit this afternoon a little bit. But there is something with this as far as when we look across this landscape. And of course, the other thing I like to think about is we manage in a Great Plains environment, historically grassland. And so if I'm going to visit about grasslands, I really want to start pulling that context into. There were things that shaped and drove this system. Those plants are still here today if we have true sod, native sod grasslands. And so we know that there's just different disturbances, there's drivers. And so we want to make sure that we understand some of those buckets or those pieces at least. If I'm going to manage grasslands, keep grass, I need to know something about some of those drivers. I really appreciate Mark's presentation again from the grazing standpoint, herbivory. We got to do with animals, livestock, they're part of the system, they drive this system. Fire is a huge one. Now I've got this statement here at the bottom, fluctuating, different intensities, intervals, and so we know there's differences from eastern Kansas to western about what that interval might have been, that intensity, those kind of things, especially in the fire bucket. But fire might be new to some of us, it is not new to grasslands. The final thing is understanding the context of all that. Drought, climate variability. Our precipitation environments drove a warm season dominated grassland. Tall grass in the east, short grass out here towards the west, mixed grass kind of right through here. But if we don't either understand some of the concepts with that, if we think we need to completely exclude one of those, then it's really going to be tough to manage grasslands in this particular environment. The other thing is if some of those start getting out of whack is we become more vulnerable to certain things in the landscape. So I want to kind of break that down. Of course, we know historically as well as we don't have the same amount of grasslands. We've had significant conversion of grassland, only about 40% remaining from the standpoint when we look about the entire Great Plains, and there's kind of Kansas depicting some of that. It's one of the interesting things that what ecosystem do you think the students in the local schools hear about that's threatened? Rainforest. Does anybody know how much of the rainforest is left? 90%. About 83%. Yeah. Coral reef's another one. Now I'm not advocating for those systems to leave, but it's amazing how we don't even know kind of outside our back door is that there's some of these systems are unique and rare. And that's what I want to hope kind of paint the deal, or just how can we help even some of our youth? But we have a cool and amazing ecosystem right at our door. And too many times we probably take it for granted. What drove a lot of that loss was cultivation. These prairie soils are very productive. They can grow a lot of they grow a lot of crops on that. And of course when that happens, I really want to concentrate on this graph on the right hand side here, but if that type of a threat or an impact happens, it's pretty darn severe. Across the bottom there, the severity of the impact, and then it's going to really resist recovery. There's enough things that change an ecosystem process. It's going to take a lot to recover from that standpoint. So if those kind of things in the upper right happen, it's pretty dramatic, okay? And again, each one of those things are those ecosystem services. I'll use that term a couple of times. That's what I'm talking about. How much productivity on the landscape, wildlife habitat, hydrological cycles, water, those things are going to be impacted. So what we do is, this happens to be actually the land cover in Kansas. And so we can see the dark brown, that's our cropland areas. The light tan would be our rangeland or native grassland areas. And of course in the eastern part of the state we have those cool season pastures, kind of that yellow tinge across there. Red's the different cities, and of course we're sitting at that blue star this afternoon. And so look at that as we can kind of concentrate, we've lost grasslands. What I look is I see a huge opportunity. We have some amazing landscapes in Kansas. How do we help them thrive, right? We've got a lot of opportunity right at our back door here. And so to look at that though is what's going on in them? Are things going well? Are there other threats? And that sort of dives into this particular topic this afternoon is we know a little bit more now that we didn't know even just 3 or 4 years ago. I wanted to share some of those tools and that information this afternoon. What I don't think we realize is that if wood encroachment occurs, it's just as severe of an impact, and it's really resistant to recovery. If it goes that way, it's very resistant to recovery, and we're seeing that more and more as those things move. And when I say wood encroachment, I mean it's, again, that increase in the density numbers, plants in the landscape. Or the other thing is that woody plants expanding is grasslands losing. It's at the expense of. It's not harmony, it's competition, and we're losing when this happens in the landscape. So, how are we doing? Is that occurring in Kansas? Is that an issue? So, some places we'll drive down the road and we got some really cool open landscapes. They fit that page 3 definition. Drive down the road a mile, turn the corner. We've got the same kind of situations though. And so at local levels, and I don't know, probably you see that as well. Certain places have some trees, some might be tree free. Shortgrass prairie, there are no trees out there, are there? That's just outside of Scott City, around Healy area. Woody encroachment. There's not a place in Kansas that's immune to woody encroachment. And we're seeing that more and more from that standpoint. And so, but that's really local scales. One tool I wanted you to make aware of that just came online about 3 years ago was this Landscape Explorer tool. And so we in the local offices had some historic images and we could look at that 1940s, 50s time frame. You can see at that time, what did the land cover, what did the land look like, and then current today, like I think it's the newest Google image is what's available, and it's a slider tool. You can see those changes. And so this happens to be an example out in Saline County around Salina. But in 1954, we can see that little square area of trees on the left-hand side of that photo. And today, just how much significant. That's significant. So when we think about that impact, severity of impact, it's very resistant to change if those things happen. But yet that's still at local level. That's a quarter section or so. What came online around about the 2020 time frame was now all of a sudden as we can think about seeing this issue at large scales. Not only that, but through time. So how rapidly or how are things changing? You know, we know that, okay, in 1950 something, it was this, today, but how's that scaling? How's that change occurring? And so this rangeland analysis platform, if you've not seen this one or pulled online, is a really a pretty cool tool. What they use is a lot of on-the-ground data. If you ever let one of our USDA NRCS person do a national resource inventory point in grassland, it helped make this tool available. So thank you if you allowed permission for some of that data. So we had production, we had species composition, we had those things that fed this model. What it does then is give us a chance to look across the landscape at vegetation cover. We can think about functional groups. Trees, shrubs, perennial grasses, annual grasses, bare ground. We weren't able to do that before. We had satellite images since the late 80s, but we couldn't interpret that or see what was going on. What are things that are changing or might be changing in our landscape? The other one that's really cool is the herbaceous biomass as well. So if cover changes, we can also see what that impact is to the amount of forage, herbaceous. What I mean by that is grasses, forbs. That production in the landscape can change and we can actually track and see that. So this is the kind of map that we start seeing this. In this particular instance, this is in red. That's where woody plants, the signal for woody plants is stronger. It's this idea of transitions. Yellow, we're on it friends. We're seeing movement in those two groups. And in green, we have a stronger signal for grass dominating those landscapes. Okay, 1990 time frame. 2020. So in about a 30-year period of time frame is, I like to call it the red wave. Some people call it the green glacier. We see some significant movement of woody plants in the landscape at the expense of grassland. And so that's what this map. All you have white, you know, that's those cropland areas. This is looking at those sort of those grassland type areas. So significant increase as we move further west. First time I saw that, it's pretty disheartening. Has anybody in here tried to control woody plants? You guys don't have? Yeah, I tell people I've been running clippers since I was old enough to do it, and I still am. Problem is, I was in some red back in the 90s though too. I grew up in the northeast part of the state from that standpoint. But yeah, it's frustrating because it isn't because local ranchers haven't been trying to do something, because we're concerned with it. It's just maybe some of our methods or our approach to it isn't as effective as we'd like it to be. Okay? And so those are some of the things I want to cover this afternoon is can we look at that a little bit different or better understand what's going on. A huge thing that this impacts, obviously for production, is loss in forage means a loss of potential ag production. So that same tool, you can actually look at two different sites. Again, I just picked a site outside of Salina there. Side A was grass, stayed grass. And I apologize for the collar. That's not showing up as well in the room, but that's actually stayed open grass at that time. So through that tools, we can see what the production did. Those bouncing, that's what drought or variability in rainfall did. So we know that that changes through time. 1990 was mostly open, a few small trees there. It held right in there, and all of a sudden we started seeing that pretty significant decline. One thing that we like to talk a lot in Kansas about is that happens is drought, right? Site B, we don't need to talk about drought anymore. We've completely decoupled from precipitation. We're talking about forage production. We're in a persistent perennial drought when this occurs in the landscape. We have lost production, and it stays there. You don't see the up and up and down like you see up there. So if that happens at local scale, that's a concern for the local producer. What does that mean for Kansans? Well, we can look at that across the whole state and where these transits occurred. So what I like to say is, we had a potential here. If we would have kept tree cover the same on Site B, we've been coming in right about that same line. Didn't happen, we came down here, call that a yield gap. Kansas had a potential. If tree cover wouldn't have changed, we had a potential to have this kind of production. It did change, we came in down here. 1.9 billion pounds, just 2022 year alone. That's a missed opportunity. When I think about it in hay bales, that was 1.6 million hay bales that weren't produced across the state in that herbaceous biomass. Going about cows, 157,000 head of cows could have ran in the state for a year round that weren't there. When I start seeing those things, I think about what about the next generation of rancher that doesn't have a ranch to come back to. The other thing would be, if I care about wildlife, that material is nesting material for grassland birds. If I'm interested in pollinators, that's forbs that are pollinating species that aren't there. Significant impacts across the landscape, and it's huge volumes of it. Really concerning. I got this slide from Keith Harmony, who's a range scientist that's stationed with KSU but stationed at Hayes. Tried to do a couple of number crunching with it and look at that. Since we're able to track that 1990 time frame, what did that actually equal in sort of lost calf revenue? So these are December 2024 prices looked at, but it's about $2 billion of lost potential through that time frame using those market prices. Significant impact to Kansas economy. These QR codes hopefully will work from that standpoint, but if you want to look at your individual county, click on that and you can actually see some of that for your individual county and what some of those losses or differences were, those yield gaps were. But if I don't care about, if I'm in town, what do I care? What's interesting is woody plants are impacting, again, all those ecosystem services. So I don't have time to break each one of these down. I put these in here for Remember Me. Jesse Nippert up at Cons is doing some work looking at how does it change water. Interesting enough, the shrub environment, they looked at shrub encroachment in the Flint Hills region, just that area. Shrubs pump about twice the volume of water out of the landscape each day than grasses do. With the amount of cover change that's happened in the Flint Hills, that's enough water to fill Tuttle Creek Reservoir 5 times in a single year. Pumping out. What they're realizing is in that watershed is they've actually sustained or increased water or precipitation. The streams are drying up. It's not calculating there well. Some of that rooting is actually even changing some of the bedrock formation to make actually that water move in different ways. It's really concerning if those things happen. Is water an issue in Kansas? You bet it is. The upper portion, if I care about biodiversity, a lot of times I think about cover crops or the mixes. I also like to joke is, I like working in nature's cover crop, grasslands. That's a historic grassland from that standpoint. But what happens is this is if trees increase, what number of species do I find? It doesn't take a whole lot of trees and we start losing species diversity. So we see that going down. Grassland birds, unfortunately all birds have on the decline since the 70s. Grassland birds have taken the steepest hit, about a 53% loss. Thinking about carbon, I don't like thinking about any of these things centric or tunnel vision wise. It's an ecosystem, there's a lot of dynamics, but if woody encroachment happens is we start putting carbon above ground. And in a Great Plains environment, it becomes potentially lost in a drought and or fire. And so while it might store a little bit more in the ecosystem, it could readily be lost. So grassland, grassroots, we see such a small percentage of what happens each year in that above ground portion, so much more below ground, usually 2 to 3-fold. So that's a safer environment for that carbon to cycle through. This one's really interesting. Some work that's been done out of Oklahoma realizes that where those woody plants are, the cedar canopies have moved in, increased tick numbers. Open grasslands, about 16 ticks. kind of a cedar woodland, about 202, and a real dense, almost 400. Same thing with mosquitoes. That's another issue as well. And so when we think about some of these pathogens or these diseases, is that that's allowing to move across that red wave in our state. And we see some, we hear about some more occurrences. Anybody serve on a local fire department? Okay, yeah, thank you for doing that. What kind of environment does our volunteer firefighters head out to when these dynamics change? And so in a grassland environment, you could have maybe 4 to 6 foot flame lengths on grass. Start changing to about 30-foot flames, and you have some kind of a volatile fuel in that. So the changes how we might approach that. While they go out and try to save property and life, they're having to face a whole different type of fire when these things happen at large scales as well. Hopefully one of those matters to you, or you're impacted by it. For darn sure we realize that it's not just a rancher problem, it's not just an ag sector problem, but it's a Kansan problem. And so it expands out besides just agriculture. The other things I want to really be sure of, though, does anybody fight any other issues in grasslands like oral blue stem or Shirishia lespedis in the east? Some Phragmites is occurring in some locations. Okay, even sometimes, anybody seen any maybe graze, not on your place, your neighbors of course, but maybe some Spanish grazing that's impacting some grassland. So we have some of those things going on there, but I really appreciate one of our science advisors. If we're talking about this, well, that's going on. It's like trying to rearrange furniture in a house that's burning down. Because if we're losing the ecosystem as those become new points, if that happens at large scales. I think that was really a reality for me in going that is what do we need to really stare right in the face and go, if we want grasslands, we want these opportunities. Also, Joe says, I really want to be a range specialist. I do not want to become a remnant specialist in my occupation. And if we don't change some things, that might be exactly what happens as far as losing some of these grassland landscapes. So I'm not concentrating on those. I'm not saying that they're not important, but let's put some context to how we might approach those or prioritize those. So past efforts have not equated. So I tell you, we've done brush management. We've cost shared on those things. We've come up a little bit short, okay? That red wave is still moved. Some of the things we see, and or if you want to look at page 80 to 81, is what are some of those things we want to avoid? I'm not going to break each one of these down today, but it's some things to think about. First off is denying that we have a problem. That woody encroachment won't happen to me. That's one of the huge issues, and we see it more and more moving west and further west. Really related to seed sources, and we'll break that down. Random scattered efforts. We've gone in there and we've blown holes in it. And we see these really locally, just successes, but the pressure's always around you. And so we keep it going right around you and keeps heading west and covering more rangeland areas. And finally, the idea of chasing the problem. It's like, yeah, we'll get to it next week, next year, and all of a sudden it's past us and we're trying to catch it. And right now, nobody's catching it. It's huge efforts and we're still trying to catch it. So what I like about as we move here and further west, you are in the best place of anywhere in Kansas to see it first and get ahead of it. And so that's what I really like being able to chance to be out here is see that early and then take action early before you ever think you might have a problem. So let's break this down. There's 2 documents. One of them is actually, I had a postcard over there. That'll take you a link to this kind of a document. And of course, this pocket guide has a few of these things in it. So I'm just going to kind of visually break a few things down. But again, I don't do grassland myself and run a few small cows and stuff. But this vulnerability framework, I want to break that down. It's really made it click for me. I hope it makes you take a look at the landscape a little different as well. First is we start seeing from a vulnerability lens. Everybody sees the cedar trees, right? Just a couple out there. Historically we did. And said, yeah, we ought to probably take those out sometime. But there's still a lot of open grassland out there. The other thing is, well, doggone it, that one's in the fence. I don't want to nick the chain, dole it. So, yeah, we'll get to it tomorrow, next year, and all of a sudden, 10 years later, it's still there. We drive in and out. What we did not see, though, is that encroachment, when I say encroachment phase, is that we've got a mature tree. So it can produce seed. In your book on page 8, there's a ton of information on a cedar tree. And so in that, it talks about how many seeds does a mature cedar tree make. Anybody got a guess or want to pull up the page 8? Yeah, 1.5 million seeds. So that's one thing that's pretty news to me. The other thing we found out was that most of that actually gets dispersed within about 200 yards of that mature tree. So unfortunately, it's not just a tree, no tree situation. Now I've got spatial risk. So when we start looking at a 200-yard buffer around that tree, so now one tree has a spatial influence of about 26 acres. So give me 6 trees, I'll get a quarter section with pressure on it. Doesn't mean that it can take off on it, but it's got pressure on it constantly. That's what that grassland's experiencing. So I'm not a crop. I don't grow crops either from that standpoint, but if I take 1.5 million seeds and I place them on 26 acres, what would be my seeds per acre? Anybody got a calculator to do that math for me? $1.5 million on 26 acres.
57,000. 57,000.
57,000. What do you plant corn at out here? Is anybody a crop farmer that plants? Around 30? Back east, I know. Yeah. So hopefully, to me, that's a crap load of seed out there, right? That just to me, it's like that's a ton of seed pressure all the time. Amazingly enough, though, so that's experiencing it. So my best bet is, can I keep that sucker from germinating? So it's experiencing it. Can I keep it down? Unfortunately, in this particular situation, we're starting to see that. Something's glitches that. We can be the best grassland manager, but a drought comes along and puts a little weakness in the system, it's going to take that opportunity. If the seed's not there, can it? If the seed's not there, it can't grab that opportunity. So that's really where we're trying to get to that. But knowing that, and so boy, does that ever make me want to go cut each one of those trees today and decrease that spatial risk? We also have to think about these. Recruitment side is, it is a tree no tree. So they definitely are influencing a small space. Our biggest efforts are we've got to make sure that sucker never gets to maturity. For a cedar tree, that's in about 5 to 6 years, and it'll start producing seed. So all of a sudden, those become an addition to spatial risk. So we've got kind of a little bit of lull in time, but not much before we start seeing this expansion. So when you start seeing trees becoming reproductive pretty quick, and that kind of scale, you can see why that red wave is moving fairly rapidly. Finally, this idea intact, when I say that, tree-free and seed-free. Lowest risk, lowest cost, easiest to maintain. Doesn't mean there's no risk, because there's always one of those seeds that can make it a little bit further than 200 yards. But if we have that kind of environment, that's huge to ranchers and managing ranchland landscapes. What we found out is those are much smaller, or way further in the distance than we thought in the past. And so how do we make more of that is honestly the goal with a lot of this moving forward. Just another view lens here, we can see the mature trees in the back. We'd expect some kind of dispersal zone. And sure enough, those trees read the book because that's right where they're showing up. And we got those recruitment right there. And so what's nice about that is if I know where seed sources are, that's the biggest thing that drives encroachment out. What's one of the best things we can do? Not introduce seed. Not put seed in grassland landscapes. Okay? That's huge. And of course, intact here, again, those trees, probably a couple years, all of a sudden that wouldn't be intact anymore. That's now experiencing seed pressure. We've got to push back. We've got to find these sources and push back. So that's the exposure side of the equation. I think that's what we sort of didn't understand real well or took for granted, especially the spatial side of it. So hopefully now that when you drive home, you'll see a little bit different landscape. Anybody have any hedge trees? Are blessed with those? Yeah. How many seeds in a hedge out there? About 200 to 300. I've seen a couple trees on the drive out that they're doing really well, so it's going to be a good seed year for them, unfortunately. And of course, you know, cedar trees and hedge trees, there are male and female trees. And so there are those, we can distinguish those and go after that. That's one of the things I got at home and actually gone out this girdle, found those trees. I cut into that cambium layer and treat those, at least get the seed production stopped on those. Locust trees, those pods are highly palatable. We've seen those definitely well over a quarter-mile away. Cattle or even deer consuming those. Hoop it out the back, it's a perfect environment for them to spread as well. This is one of the things that we've started trying to help is we had a few ranchers early on in the process. So this is a new look for even NRCS. We used to say, well, wait until it's 5% canopy, then we can help you with cost share, these kind of things. Looking back, yeah, terrible decision on that. We've got to hit it earlier. And that's what we're trying to do is work alongside ranchers. Go, I want to see my ranch through that vulnerability lens. So this is the ranch that let us work early on with that. Historically, we would have mapped out, here's some of the trees they had. There's a couple of red dots out in the open, but there's still a lot of grassland there. That was kind of their, he said, one of his cleanest pastures. Pretty low maintenance. What we did is we came back in there, and with understanding spatial risk, what he was actually managing. Because he kept saying, I feel like I'm not winning. I'm spending more on chemical, I'm spending more time, and it seems like I can't get ahead. Well, sure enough, that's what the grassland's experiencing, and that's exactly what he's trying to push against. At the same time, it started allowing us where this block right here is pretty significant tree canopy. So I asked myself, if I had 4 hours this afternoon on the branch, how could I make the most impact? Where would I go? Too many times we're pretty guilty of going in there, and I could spend 4 hours all afternoon, put a dent in a few trees, but I've changed spatial risk to 0. Because it's going to take multiple days or maybe even machines to come in there. Out on the top of that ridge there was about 5 or 6 trees that probably in that afternoon I could have got down. That's the kind of awesome movement. If I could take that risk off, I can start pushing back. Not forgetting about that, but where can we find our quick wins? Where can my time investment actually mean something to reduce the amount of trying to manage everywhere? Because that kind of situation, they're managing everywhere. The other thing is I hope is as you drive home or as we drive out to the ranch is you're going to see the landscape a little different. Hopefully we start seeing some of this risk way earlier and we take that action. Because we can get passive about a lot of things. But I'm hoping that is. I also joke too is it might lead you to drinking though too, so be careful. Locating quick wins. These are some other maps, and I'll have a link to one of those a little bit later, but where am I in my landscape? This is the kind of maps that we can get from satellite imagery going, where are mostly green or sweet sage, sort of those tree-free areas? Where might we start and be able to really anchor to and build out from? The red is where we have mature trees. Some of the gray is where it's really dark trees. This is an eastern Kansas view I took of that. So here's the ranch that was kind of interested in doing something. They're close to a core. How might they think about pushing out? Because if they start pushing away, that helps the neighbor too, them and the neighbor. Or why might, if I own the green, why might I want to help that neighbor or at least encourage something? Because it means something for both of us on that spatial risk. So you look at that map and it looks pretty yellow and stuff like that. Yeah, it's pretty dark. That's the landscape I'm looking at. That's the actual encroachment map. We went out and took a look at it. So we've got seed sources in those different areas. We've got impact. These kind of landscapes we didn't even think about before. We'd drive right through and not even think about risk. That's what I mean by early. And so those are some of these are opportunities. What's nice is on page 32 of your pocket guide there, it talks about sort of this visioning. Is if I put this effort in, what does it really mean? Antagonist means less time, money, and energy to try to combat this. This particular land location, if they actually got rid of those seed sources, goes up to almost over 75% intact. That means something to the ranch and the ranch economics as far as maintaining that long term. It also starts going that I sure need to talk to that neighbor and that neighbor, and I can even decrease it more, right? Those opportunities. But have a vision. What can I change? At least know in my context where I'm working at. Reduce exposure. What do I do? Again, these are kind of a PAMS type of an approach. That's your picture of a cow pie with multiple locust trees right out of it. What an environment for them to get started in. Plenty of nutrients, bare ground. They took off. We think a lot about this with our kids, but boy, that's the one thing that's challenging on the back to those threads. Cultivation, it's instantaneous. We can see that change. So we really see that. And wood encroachment, it's just slow enough that we just almost become immune to it. I know even back at our home places, like all of a sudden it's like 5 years later, it's like, dang, sucker's ahead of there. You know, you just kind of becomes part of what you see. You don't even see it, kind of look past it. But don't allow young trees to become mature. Suppress it, go after those seed sources. The sensitivity side of the equation, I'm not going to have everybody hug each other here. So. Grassland sensitivity, healthy grasslands. Appreciate Mark's information that. Above, canopies in the above ground is a huge below ground gap. Again, we only see about a third of what goes on each year, and so that's what we really got to do is manage those grasslands. That if I can't change my exposure, if my neighbor won't get on board, or it's the wife's windbreak out the back door, I know I'm going to have to manage around it. So how do I keep sensitivity low when I'm next to that? Healthy grasslands, healthy root systems, don't give it a chance, okay? It also, if I can actually narrow that down, is maybe that's the only area I've taken care of that seed source other places. That's the only area I have to manage. That's doable. But getting a game plan for that particular place. The sensitivity side that I didn't think as much about, but see it more and more all the time, is fence lines or old abandoned fence lines. Anybody see those full of trees? Perch sites, right? So does that really need to be out there? And or if both neighbors burn or do things and nobody takes care of, I've got pictures of fence lines or solid cedars. Because it's not my problem, it's not my problem, but yet it's everybody's problem when you start thinking about spatial risk on that. The other thing would be is the actually native trees. So warm season grasses do not like shade. And so this happens to be from an eastern Kansas example, but that's a big old elm tree there. And while historically that might have been part of that plant community, what we're seeing though is it's changed that completely. A cool season, birds perched on it, put a cedar tree right under it. What a manager has to figure out is, can I manage that? What if I have 100 places just like that? So because of the changing around, there's a neighbor that's got a lot of seed though right next door. In this particular instance, that producer is going to actually take that down just to reduce that risk. Get rid of a perch site, reduce the risk, and also allow fire to start interacting at the base of that so they don't have to try to manage everywhere. So, everybody's still mostly awake here. So here's instead of where's Waldo, it's where's Cedar. So we'll take a second. Okay, if you think you know where it is, can anybody see it there? It's a terrible photo today, right? So it's tough to tell. But I figure that's about a 4 square foot area. We took a second to find it. It would take me 3 hours to cover an acre or scout an acre if I did a 4 square foot per second deal. Who's got that time on the ranch to go scouting and trying to find that little bugger? Most of the time it's not until it's above a vegetation canopy. There's a lot more of them. In another instance, we did a great thing. We cut down a mature tree that was a seed producer. But what there's about 50 or 60 small seedlings coming up. Because there was sensitivity under that tree. The grass wasn't very healthy. Man, it's game on for those. Who wants to go out there with a clipper, clip 50 or 60 of them just in that little spot? We spend some pretty significant time doing that. So is there anything I could use or do that would reduce my time in managing that recruitment? A goat? Browsing can be one of those. What's another one? The start of a fire, right? Fires can. Fire can interact with that. And then in some places that's a sensitive term, and I understand that. But it is one of those things that it will. It can touch all those. I can look all day and I'll probably miss 20 or 30% of them. Fire will touch it, every deal. Now I need the fuel load to do it, but that's one of the things that can. Now this is where a fire culture does exist, and so I hope Western Kansas never looks like this and trying to defend from that standpoint. But this is the one place in all that movement where it flinched. It made the wood encroachment signal flinch. And that was where a fire culture is. And so on the right-hand side here, it shows the number of fires in a 20-year period. The lighter the color, the more frequent the fire return interval. The left-hand side is where we still have grasslands. Frequent fire prevents woody encroachment. And so, again, I don't want to try to. That's the only way they're keeping that thing open, unfortunately. They have a whole different pressure than even 30 years ago. Out here, we'd have to do the same kind of thing if it's that kind of a pressure. So how do we start earlier, making sure we don't have that steep pressure, and our return intervals can be much longer. Or maybe we don't have to go out, maybe we can. Maybe the clipper and the goat can keep it done, but don't let it get to those kinds of levels. This is the other thing that talks about that. Here's our tools. You mentioned goats, yeah, that recruitment stage. Those young trees, that's a great chance to use that. Fire is the only one, though, that if I'm looking at any kind of a phase or stage, touches them all. And so you'll hear us, we'll recommend fire in the landscape. It doesn't mean annually. It means there's got to be a game plan, there's got to be a purpose, and we've got to be going after certain things with it. But fire can really interact in this landscape. So I wanted to point that out. Again, hand tools, really great for recruitment, some encroachment. The other thing is sensitivity exposure. Again, those are those components of risk. Understand that grazing management can either increase or decrease, right? It matters how we graze and making sure that plant community stays healthy. The final thing is kind of our choice then, is we understand our risk now. Some places we can't manage exposure. We have a whole different game plan. Some places we can, but we need to approach that. And again, I'm going to go back to that beginning slide. How can we use those ecological drivers to manage this? To manage this particular issue. At the same time, we've got really cool tools, really awesome machines that can tear down, cut up, do kinds of things. But if I'm going to rely on the technology only, our pockets aren't deep enough. So how do we use technology to make some of those other ecological functions drive? That's really what I want to challenge the group with, is don't rely on that one, use that to help those facilitate in the landscape more. Final thing here, getting real close to the end here, is again, a vision for success. How do we create this at landscape scales? How do we get those seed sources gone, defendable space, in lower maintenance grasslands? Not zero maintenance, but lower when it comes to woody encroachment. So let's take a look. So this is kind of the 3-county area. We're sitting about right here, 1990. So you can take a look at some of these signals as well on some of these tools with the QR code right here. 2000, 2010, 2020. Now I'll be honest, a lot of places we'll see that signal really blow up. Is there anything or any events that occurred in these 3-county areas between that time frame? I think Mark, fire. Anderson over here, I think on the eastern part of that county, Starbucks for that. So huge, that probably put a glitch in it, didn't it? So boy, do we have an opportunity then. What I challenge you with is, go look. It doesn't mean these maps are perfect, but give you a chance to look. Because where I'm seeing signals out here, in that light yellow, I want to go looking. How can we get ahead of it? That's the greatest opportunity when we're in this kind of environment. If I'm in some of these other areas, how do I know my context where I can better defend against that? Know the pressures I'm experiencing, make sure I don't let that slip. These kind of maps can try to help that. Final thing then is, again, hopefully your vision of grasslands is just a little bit different. Nothing else, just sure see woody encroachment differently. And again, I hope you don't, if it leads you to drinking, don't drink and drive. So, but it is. I want to have my kids and grandkids be able to see open grasslands. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity this afternoon. I would take some questions or things. The other thing from a standpoint of understanding grasslands is this is actually a little publication I found in a local hotel. So what does our community think grasslands are, or Kansas? With that, Aaron, I appreciate the time. Appreciate everybody. I think, well, it's going to be rest of the day and stuff too. So.